Today on BenchBriefs, we're looking at a landmark Supreme Court of Canada decision that tackled the tough question of how far mandatory minimum sentences can go before they become unconstitutional. The case is R v Nur, decided in 2015, and it's all about firearms, mandatory minimums, and the Charter's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Here's the story in simple terms. Nur was charged with possessing a loaded, prohibited firearm without a license. Under the criminal code, that offense carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. That means the judge had no choice but to impose at least 5 years, regardless of the specific circumstances of the case or the offender. Nur challenged this mandatory minimum sentence, arguing that it was unconstitutional because it could lead to grossly disproportionate punishment in less serious cases. In other words, he said that forcing a 5-year sentence in all cases, even those involving less blameworthy offenders, amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited by Section 12 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Supreme Court had to consider two main questions. First, does the mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for this particular firearms offense violate the Charter's protection against cruel and unusual punishment? And second, if the sentence does infringe on that right, can the infringement be justified under Section 1 of the Charter, which allows reasonable limits on rights and freedoms if they can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society? To understand why this case was so important, it's helpful to think about what mandatory minimum sentences are meant to do. Governments often use them to send a strong message that certain crimes are serious and to deter others from committing them. But critics argue that mandatory minimums can be too rigid, stripping judges of the discretion to consider the unique facts of each case. This can lead to sentences that are unfairly harsh, especially for offenders who may not pose a serious threat or who have mitigating circumstances. In Nur's case, the court looked closely at whether the 5-year mandatory minimum was so harsh that it violated Section 12. The court used a legal test that asks whether the sentence is grossly disproportionate to the offense in reasonably foreseeable circumstances. This means the court doesn't just look at the specific facts of Nur's case, but considers whether the law could apply to other hypothetical situations where the punishment would be unfairly severe. The Supreme Court found that the mandatory minimum sentence did indeed violate Section 12. They said that there were reasonably foreseeable cases where someone might possess a loaded, prohibited firearm without a license, but in circumstances that didn't justify such a severe penalty. For example, imagine someone who unknowingly had a prohibited firearm locked away in their home, or someone who had the firearm for a very brief moment without any harmful intent. In those cases, a 5-year prison sentence would be grossly disproportionate and therefore cruel and unusual. Because the law infringed on the Charter, the court then considered whether this infringement could be justified under Section 1. The government argued that the mandatory minimum was necessary to combat gun crime and protect public safety, but the court concluded that the law was not a reasonable limit on rights. The mandatory minimum was too broad and rigid, capturing cases that did not warrant such harsh punishment. The government failed to show that the law was carefully tailored to achieve its objective without unnecessarily infringing on individual rights. The result was that the Supreme Court struck down the mandatory minimum sentence for possession of a loaded, prohibited firearm without a license. This decision sent a clear message that while the state can impose penalties to protect society, those penalties must be proportionate and respect constitutional rights. Why does this case matter beyond Mr. Nur? First, it reaffirmed the importance of judicial discretion in sentencing, reminding us that one-size-fits-all punishments can sometimes lead to injustice. Second, it reinforced the role of the Charter as a powerful check on government laws that risk violating fundamental rights. Finally, R v Nur influenced how courts and legislatures think about mandatory minimum sentences, encouraging a more nuanced approach that balances public safety with fairness and individual rights. So, next time you hear about mandatory minimums or debates over tough-on-crime laws, remember that R v Nur stands as a landmark case showing that even well-intentioned laws must respect the limits set by our Charter, ensuring that justice is not just about punishment, but about proportionate and fair treatment under the law. Thanks for listening to BenchBriefs. Be sure to join us next time for another episode where we break down important Canadian legal cases in a way that's clear, concise, and engaging. Until then, take care.